This is Mike Hill. He's a designer who has worked on films like Blade Runner 2049 and Dune. He's also a script consultant and lecturer on the hidden meaning of stories. His lectures have been viewed hundreds of thousands of times because he has this skill of being able to take any movie, identify its subtext, and distill it down to its essence. Well, any movie except for one: Mad Max: Fury Road. I was speaking with Mike and he told me about the first time he saw Fury Road. A friend had asked him to go and see it, but he'd never seen a Mad Max movie before, and he knew nothing about its director, George Miller. So he watched
the trailer and thought, well, this is just Fast and the Furious in the desert. Like, this is going to be terrible.
Despite that, he went to see the movie anyways, and when he walked out of the theater, he was stunned.
That's not what I expected from this movie. It was like the highest form of cinema. I still don't know what Miller and the other guys did to achieve that effect. It shouldn't work, but it works. Because on the one hand, there's this elaborate melodrama that is borderline psychotically over the top, to the point where it's like this could end up being very, very silly. But at the same time, that seems to be concealing a layer of nuance and subtlety of lots of ingredients that you don't necessarily consciously taste. A dude with a flame-throwing guitar in the middle of the desert in a huge road chase, but yet it feels like it could have been written by Socrates. It just feels like a magician has just suddenly like deceived you into the trick. And at the end of it, like, how the hell did he do that? You know, like, when did that happen? Every time I look into it, I find more and more theories to try and justify why it works.
Nothing about Mad Max Fury Road is simple. Even if you think about the main character of the movie, it's an interesting
quirk that with Mad Max, it's called Mad Max, but everyone thinks the story is about Furiosa, but actually the character that has the biggest arc is Nux. Nux is Latin, and it means seed, as in like seed that will grow into something.
For me, the biggest character arc is Nux, because he goes from being a fanatic devotee of the Immortan, convinced that this is his day to die, historic on the Fury Road.
If I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die historic on the Fury Road.
He's disabused, or the events disabuse him of his belief system. Being someone who has very little time, makes the choice to make the most of what he's got, and then basically relinquishes his own self-interest in the cause of a greater good. So that's a very obvious arc in that character.
This realization that Nux was the subversive protagonist of the film was Mike's first entry point to trying to understand Fury Road.
I thought there's got to be a connection here because these two characters are literally connected by blood.
It was through exploring the Max and Nux relationship that Mike realized Fury Road might be harder to explain than he first thought. That George Miller
was working on like a different level. The analogy of Max as a blood bag. At first you think, okay, blood bag, what does that mean? And then you realize that Max is a universal blood donor. He's able to give life energy to anyone he chooses because he's a universal donor. And then you think, well, how far can that metaphor be taken? Well, in the opening scene when he's escaping through that system, Miller intermittently does these flash cuts. If you actually look at the backgrounds, it turns into quite literally an artery, which is like he's a blood in the system. What Miller's effectively saying is that this society is an organism.
After putting these pieces together, Mike started looking into George's background and found out
that he was a doctor. So suddenly you're like, okay, well, this guy's got a huge vocabulary with biological systems. And then you start thinking, well, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Well, you start looking at the way that the character names for these characters, the misshapen little guy that handles the telescope, which communicates between the hemispheres of the Citadel, between Gastown, between the Bullet Farm. His name is Corpus Callosum. But Corpus Callosum is a play on words for corpus callosum, which if you're familiar with biological systems, that's a neuroscientific part, there's designation for the section of the brain which communicates between the left and the right hemispheres. So the corpus callosum is responsible for sending information between the two executive centers of the brain in order to make decisions. What's his role in the story? His role in the story is to communicate between the overruling, let's say, executive centers of the Citadel. I realized that his emphasis on the corpus callosum might be associated with a book called The Master and His Emissary. I suspect that the principles of this book may be fundamental to the Mad Max story.
The Master and His Emissary was written by British philosopher and neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist.
In the book, McGilchrist puts out that all of human evolution, all of modern history, and the Western civilization is dependent upon the relationship between the left and the right hemispheres. And the left and the right hemispheres effectively are maintained and run by the corpus callosum. The left and the right hemispheres are the masculine and feminine sides of our psyche. When I say masculine and feminine, I don't mean feminine in the sense of female and masculine in the sense of male. I mean traits.
And when these traits are out of balance is when you start to run into problems.
And it's very important to remember that we therefore need to be alternating our way of thinking, not getting stuck in one particular paradigm, as I believe in the modern West we have.
McGilchrist lays out that the development of the Western world towards communism and socialism, which is where a tyrant deceives the people into allowing him to allocate the private property of all the individuals and eventually allocates that property to himself, is because of a left hemispheric dominance. And a left hemispheric dominance is what happens when the left hemisphere gets to make the decisions. Now, the left hemisphere is masculine traits. And what that means is it deals in the ordering principle. And this is critical. It is the part of the brain which sees everything in the world as things. So the left hemisphere effectively is responsible for seeing the world as objects to be manipulated. The right hemisphere is feminine traits. And feminine traits means the relational values between things. That means not seeing things as objects, but seeing them as flowing relational patterns that are always need to be brought into harmony. The right hemisphere sees the big picture. The left hemisphere sees granular details and wants to manage them and manipulate them for its own benefit. And the left hemisphere is incredibly stupid. It's unaware of its inability to see the big picture. Therefore, it feels a need to constantly expand its domain of power, because it doesn't realize that it will eventually kill the thing that it's surviving off of. They don't actually see their relationship to the world around them as being anything other than domination. Like everything is to be manipulated, everything is to be controlled.
If you think about left hemisphere dominant thinking in the context of Fury Road, you get a Morton Joe.
He's obsessed with control, acquisition, seeing everything as objects, seeing everything as things. And the major motif of McGilchrist's work is that the left hemisphere sees everyone as a thing. And the whole mantra of the film is, we are not things. So I believe that what Miller was effectively saying is that if there isn't a feminine balance in the world or a society, you will get a tyranny. And that tyranny operates like a parasitic cancer. And what is Immortan Joe? He's quite literally a cancer.
If Immortan Joe is representative of the left hemisphere of the brain, then Furiosa and the Wives represent the right hemisphere of the brain. Therefore, at the end of the movie, they don't just ascend the elevator to reclaim the Citadel, but the film is also
saying that the right hemispheric traits of holistic, spiritual, relational thinking is being elevated back up towards the upper echelons of society. Basically saying that society is being brought back into balance.
And if you ask Mike, this interpretation of Fury Road makes it a cautionary tale. Because if you look at
Western society, the left hemisphere has been given such great technological power that it's ended up subverting and controlling and killing the right hemisphere's influence, which is where we get to totalitarian states. All totalitarian states are sociological equivalents of a right hemispheric stroke, which is the right hemisphere is not present in the executive decision-making of society. And in Mad Max, that's the message, is that a totalitarian state run by a left hemispheric dominant tyrant.
Wait. This is important to understand the rest of Mike's analysis of Fury Road. Is he saying that the West is totalitarian and not capitalistic?
Yeah, for sure. We often refer to the system we live in now as late-stage capitalism. We've never experienced capitalism. In order for capitalism to actually exist, there cannot be any individual who has control of the money supply. As long as one central entity has the ability to generate money, which is what leads to inflation, they have the ability to allocate and take resources from other producing members of society. Because money is effectively a commodity that you can control that has the buying rights to everything else in society. So if you can print money the same way that a farmer prints corn, you don't just have access to corn, you have access to everything else that people produce. As long as there is a financial socialist system in play, the end result of that will, in its extremes, always be communism. Now, socialism, financial socialism, which is what we have in the West right now, which is where central banks can print $6 trillion and allocate it to their friends, which leads to huge inflation and price increases. That means people can't buy things, they can't afford things. As soon as you print $6 trillion, like in the US, for example, you've expanded the money supply by 40%. Now that means that everyone's cash holdings has 40% less purchasing power within 2 years, which is what we've seen, right? If you look at the price of things go up by 40%.
The cost of eggs skyrocketing, gas prices on the rise as well.
What I think Miller was alluding to is the cycle that has been going on throughout history, which is, and this is not a theoretical concept, but the idea of the soft movement between socialism towards heavy communism is always dependent upon the control of the money supply.
While there's no money in the wasteland, there is water. And so in order for there to be a tyranny, you don't have to control the money supply. You just have to control whatever the most valuable resource is. And when it came to Fury Road, Mike
always understood the water to be a sociological metaphor, because the water of a societal system is money. Money and the distribution of money, which is what the state does in a communist system or a socialist system, is when one entity has the ability to print money, they have control over everyone else because they can allocate it to people as they see fit. What I always understood that to mean in the context of the opening scene was that those who control the water control society. In our society, those who control the money printer control society. I believe that what they were pointing to is that water is the liquid of life for an organism, but money is the liquid of life for a society. Because if you don't have access to money or you don't have liquidity in an economy, then the economy itself will fall into depression and decay and war.
Where does the water come from?
He pumps it up from deep in the earth, calls it aquacola, and claims it all for himself.
And because he owns it, he owns all of us.
I don't like him already.
Mike's theory doesn't end there. You've got Immortan Joe, who's the tyrant, but then you've also got his oligarchs, the bullet farmer and the people eater.
Be careful! Protect the assets! Just one angry shot for Furiosa!
The bullet farmer, from a sociological perspective, what does he do? He controls and allocates resources for war. Or what's that in the modern parlance? That's the military-industrial complex. That's the complex of who gets funded by the government money printing, which is like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Then you've got the people eater. Well, the people eater is the IRS. It's the state allocation system. The people eater is the bureaucratic system that designates property, that takes property, that chooses assets and liabilities for the state's accounts, which is why when they say the people eater, the wives say,
And there's the people eater himself.
Coming to count the cost.
and the people eater doesn't see anything in the system of Mad Max as anything but an asset. So whenever he turns up, he'll literally turn up with his clipboard and say, we've lost this many things, this many people, and no one's seen as a person.
We are down 30,000 units of gasoline, 19 canisters of nitro, 12 assault bikes, 7 pursuit vehicles. The deficit mounts, and now, sir, you have us stuck in a quagmire.
From a really broad perspective, from an audience perspective, what they're experiencing indirectly through these characters is a broad representation of the larger society in which we live. Everyone knows what it's like to deal with the IRS. People are thinking, what is this whole people eater up to? Like they're eating my value, my life value, and giving it to who? To the bullet farmer. And why is the bullet farmer generating bullets to have endless wars? Right? Well, he's doing that on behalf of the money printer, which is Immortan Joe. And Immortan Joe is doing all of this to maintain a monopoly. That's the way I've interpreted it. Now, of course, it's an interpretation, but I think it's very clear that if you look at those three figures, Immortan Joe's a tyrant, the bullet farmer generates wars, and the people eater is there to see everything as a commodity to be valued. That's a pretty sweet, simple metaphor for the most complex thing that we know, which is human society.
A film has to work viscerally, emotionally, intellectually, in terms of it has to work in the context of its time, in terms of its cultural anthropology, its politics, and ultimately mythologically. It has to tick all those boxes, I believe. and more.
When I said that Mike views Fury Road as a cautionary tale, it's not just in the sense that totalitarianism is bad. It's much deeper than that.
When I look at the eventual Mad Max design, and I think about it through the lens of that sociological metaphor of the end stages of a political system, which is effectively tyrannical and not sustainable. One of the themes you get in those systems is bread and circus, which is the idea that you keep the public engaged, distracted, and at war. And as long as you're giving them like occasional handouts and you put on a load of entertainment for them and you keep them envisioning war as a thing of glory and as a thing of dramatic value, which is what the whole idea of gladiators were for, is to have a theatrical war available to keep the public from rising up. So they were given bread and they were given entertainment. When you see the world of Mad Max through that lens and you start to look at when they go out into the desert and you've got all of the cars are like representations of Americana, but you've also got elements of WWF, which is that everything's kayfabe. Everything's larger than life. Everything's dramatizing war as if it's a religion. You know, we're on the road to Valhalla. The war boys, all of their religious impulse is being channeled towards this idea of celebrating death and warfare. And you've got the Duphoria, and he's there like before an NFL game starts when someone sings the national anthem. It's like, you know, Lady Gaga, and there's flames and fireworks. And you realize that actually, in some sense, this is very close to our modern world where we're given bread and circus. And it's bread and circus, the more a society reaches its end state decadence, and it's on an unsustainable path towards collapse, the more people are fed, the culture is fed to believe in this operatic drama that celebrates ridiculous things, but that takes people's patriotic impulse and places it towards something utterly insane, utterly crazy, right? And what does Max say at the beginning of the movie? Very important line. He says,
"As the world fell, each of us in our own way was broken. It was hard to know who was more crazy. Me or everyone else."
That's, yeah, again, all theory. I might be completely just interpreting this, but I would put good money on it that if you push that towards Miller, he might say, that's not what I was thinking, but I don't think he would say, well, that's a completely insane interpretation. I think he'd say, oh yeah, maybe I didn't think about that consciously, but yeah, it seems to make sense. But that's just a theory.
You might not agree with Mike in his interpretation of Fury Road, and you don't have to. That's the beautiful thing about art. You take this thing that someone else has made and you bring your own experience and your own knowledge and you form a perspective on it that is unique to you. George might not have intentionally put any of this into Fury Road, but he wouldn't tell Mike he's wrong either.
That's the key to this, that all narratives have to be in the eye of the beholder.
I spoke to Mike for an hour and a half, and we barely scratched the surface of his interpretation of Fury Road. We didn't talk about how the movie mirrors the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was written by Nietzsche in the 1800s. We didn't talk about how metaphorical death and rebirth play a role in the film, or the symbolic significance of the hand, the boot, or the mask. And there's so much more we could have gotten into, and all of these different theories are not only what make Fury Road so complex and hard to understand, but also so incredible. When you think about how much intention was put into this single film,
it's probably one of the biggest achievements in film, because it's like it's so subversive that a road race can win 6 Oscars and everyone loves it.
One of the things we like to do is put a lot of stuff, what I like to call a lot of iceberg under the tip. So even though the film on the surface is one long extended chase, there's a lot of stuff happening underneath, and it's there for people to pick up or not.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe, and if you liked this video, then you would love my 2-part 7-hour deep dive into the life and career of George Miller, which you can find on the Artwell podcast. And if you want us to do a part 2 where Mike dives into even more of his theories, let me know in the comments.